Thanks for joining us here on the Naked Gaming Podcast with me, Chris Barrow. We're back this month with another episode of Monkey Island Discs. That's where we talk to people about their favourite games and gaming memories. And I'm delighted to say today's guest is the video game writer Rhianna Pratchett, who's worked on huge games that you've probably played like Heavenly Sword and the reboot of Tomb Raider. She's also the daughter of Terry Pratchett, who himself was a huge fan of games. We'll come on to that later. But now we start off with a classic console.
It was the Sinclair ZX81, a very old, very boxy black and white machine. And it was a game called Mazogs, and I think I was about 6. And my dad had brought it home because he was very into electronics and robotics and things like that. And he showed it to me, and I think I was quite scared initially because of the monsters in it and things like that. And it was little pixelated crabby creatures going around a maze like this, and you were a little pixelated person, but you got to pick up a pixelated sword and fight back against the monsters. And I think it was that sense of justice and revenge I could have on these monsters that kind of hooked me in. And I watched a lot of Conan, so I was big on anything that had a sword, and it sort of started from there. And I got a lot of my father's hand-me-down machines, his hand-me-down games, and we used to play games together. So I would sit next to him with the graph paper, and he would sort of drive the game and I would navigate and I would draw the maps, because this was long before there were maps in the game or even maps in the box. So you kind of had to do your own. And sometimes there were really big games like Head Over Heels, which always had this massive isometric game, huge lands. Alien 8, Night Law, where you turned into a werewolf at night, and you could only solve certain puzzles that way. And then I sort of carried it on with the little girl who moved in next door. So she was 8 and I was 11, and we were playing things like Leisure Suit Larry, for example, which back then it was kind of gatekeepered as a 18 title, but they didn't know how to do it then. So they would ask you, "Are you 18?" questions, but they were about quite involved things like history and the American political process. So we ended up having to look things up in books so we could get into a video game. And we learned the word prophylactic from Leisure Suit Larry, which was an important thing for a young person to know about. We learned the word falafel from Conquest of Camelot. And this was like, I lived in Somerset, in the deepest, darkest Somerset. Like, it was a sneeze of a village. Like, we had a pub and that was it. There wasn't even a one-horse to be a one-horse town. It was that tiny. So you kind of had to make your own entertainment. And so we would play the games together, and as well as Leisure Suit Larry, there was Monkey Island, there was King's Quest, Space Quest, Day of the Tentacle, lots of adventure games. And so gaming to me was very social before it became social in the way we think about it now. And I used to exchange games with girlfriends at school, things like the Gabriel Knight games. So it was my early days were very sort of adventure game based, side-scrolling platformers like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, isometric games like Head Over Heels, weird shit like the Rocky Horror game, which I didn't really. I don't know what happened at the end. All I remember was you were supposed to find the bits of the rocket, but someone kept stealing your clothes, and you couldn't pick up any bits of the rocket until you'd found your clothes. I was a big fan of the movie, not so much of the game. So gaming came into my life very early, basically.
And was there a genre that you discovered that you particularly liked? Because I know that a lot of people only, when they're older, like to stick with one style of game. So either open world, or my wife loves platformer games. If it's a platformer, she'll play it, but the open world can kind of be a bit intimidating. Did you find that you were being drawn to one style, or was it more the story elements, or what was it that you liked the best about games?
I mean, it was a great time for adventure games then. I did a lot of my growing up in the 80s, so it was very good for adventure games. It was very good for fantasy and sci-fi in movies and TV. You had lots of great female-led stuff like Terminator, like Aliens, like Labyrinth. So it was full of good content, the 80s. And so it was adventure games then, because I don't really think there was a huge amount of choice. I did play the Dooms, and my dad was playing games as well, and he was very into the Dooms. Wolfenstein, the first Wolfenstein game, like where I think the word spion is etched in the back of my brain somewhere, just because it would be shouted at you like 11 billion times during the game. So that the Dooms and adventure games, probably because it was a great time for them, and then they sort of drifted off a little bit, and they sort of had a bit more of a resurgence over the last sort of half a decade or so, which is lovely to see.
It is great. Well, there's so much out now, and there's obviously the new generation of consoles, which is great because there's so many new games and new sort of IPs being made. I know you obviously went on to take a more professional interest in gaming. I wanted to ask when you first thought about actually taking it seriously, as in doing it for a career and a job. And also, did you play the early Tomb Raider games during this period and when it first came out, or did you come across them a bit further down the line? Because obviously I know you've been involved with one of the most successful iterations of that.
I played the first Tomb Raider, and my dad had played it before me. I don't know whether he felt he had to play all games before me, just to like test them out. But then he got excited and spoiled the whole bit with the T-Rex in Tomb Raider. Like, come on. He was so excited for me to play it. It was still great when I got to it, but he did rather spoil it a bit. And I think he was a big fan, a longer fan than I was. I think he played more of 2 and maybe a little bit of 3. And I made my first industry contacts. I actually went to the launch of Tomb Raider 3 at the Natural History Museum as my dad's +1, and there I made my first games industry contact, who was sitting at the same table as us, who was Dan Emery, who was the reviews editor of a new magazine coming out called PC Gear. And it also had a lot to do with a magazine called PC Zone that I really loved. It's like the early days of Charlie Brooker came from PC Zone. It's actually produced a lot of game writers over the years. Martin Corder, Mark Hill, Will Porter, lots of successful game writers have come from PC Zone. And so I ended up doing a little bit of work for PC Gear. And at that point, I trained as a journalist. I was probably at that time a bit overqualified for a games journalist, because not many of them had actual degrees in journalism. And I actually started even earlier than PC Gear on a women's magazine, a magazine called Minx, which was aimed at sort of 18 to 24-year-old women. So and they got me to start doing review work, little bits and pieces of review work. So it's tiny, like 50-word reviews and things. So I'd made some PR contacts at that time, and I was getting code in. But Dan was the first person who could actually sort of, give me work in the sort of the bigger game, the more meatier game review space. And then I applied to work on PC Zone as an editorial assistant, and I got the job. And I spent a couple of years going around the world, meeting developers, seeing how the sausage is made, sort of working out how to break down a game, how to sort of look at the different parts, how the teams operate, how they work together. And that was very, very illuminating. And I made some great contacts during that. And those are the contacts that I then used when I came out of full-time kind of office-based work and, back into the pajama-based lifestyle, which is really, I think, all I ever wanted. And I worked for The Guardian, I worked for the Sunday Times, I worked for Yahoo doing game reviews. And it just so happened that Sven Vinke from Larian Studios got in touch with me, and they were looking for a native English speaker to help polish up their script for Beyond Divinity. And obviously Larian have gone on from strength to strength with the Divinity games. And this is sort of in the earlier days. And I did some script polishing. I did a little bit of original content. I wrote a novella that I think all writers are made to read as part of the history of it. And I feel really bad, because I'm sure it was really terrible, because it's like my first prose work. But it put me off working on RPGs for a long time.
Yes, I can imagine it did, actually.
but it didn't put me on game writing, and I didn't really know that's what I was doing when I was doing it, because I'd never met a game writer before. When as a journalist, no one sat me down and said, this is our writer. I never met a me. Like, people were doing the writing, but it wasn't usually what their predominant role was. So they were usually, a designer who happened to have some time, or a producer that kind of wrote stories after work and that sort of thing. It wasn't very common at all for it to be done by a dedicated writer, especially a dedicated writer that just works in games. And so that's kind of the career I started to kick out for myself. And I went to my contacts and I literally said, hey, I'm doing this now. Do you have any work? And that sort of actually got me a few, smallish gigs. I worked on Stronghold Legends, because I was a big fan of the Stronghold castle building games. I have a real love of strategy and building games. I like, not so much these days, but when I was younger, I was a real fan of that, because I'd grown up on things like Command and Conquer and Red Alert and Dune as well. I loved, so I played a lot of those games, and I'd met Firefly as part of that. And I also got to work on a SpongeBob game and a Pac-Man game. And it wasn't sort of until I got work on Heavenly Sword that sort of kicked my career up a few notches and put it very firmly in the direction of more cinematic style games.
Well, I just remember the hype around the release of that, and like you say, it was so cinematic, the first trailer. And I think it was in conjunction with, a new generation of consoles. And it was just hugely publicized. I think it was one of the first games that was sort of announced for, was it been the PS3?
It was the PS3, yeah. It's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, and it was just, because I remember thinking, gosh, this looks unbelievable. So that was, being quite a sort of a kick up. What was the difference between what you were doing before that and then actually being handed the keys to something as big as that?
The fear and terror increased a lot. And I think, it was really, I think only the second game that Ninja Theory had done. And they'd done, I think, Kung Fu Chaos before that, which wasn't particularly cinematic. So it really was a baptism of fire for everyone. And obviously, Ninja Theory have gone on as well from strength to strength on these cinematic style experiences. It was, I was working on the entire script rather than level dialogue or mission dialogue. So it was quite a big step up, but it actually helped that I was quite active in the industry, and I'd been, I think, in the audience for a screenwriting seminar with Tamim, and the gentleman giving the screenwriting seminar invited all the game writers out to lunch. They didn't pay for the lunch. They just were trying to look for work because they were trying to get into games. And myself and Tamim took against the person doing the screenwriting course, and we were sitting next to each other. And he kind of was asking everyone what they did, and he kind of dismissed us because I was another writer, therefore I was competition, and he hadn't heard of Tamim's studio or Tamim's game. But I had, because I read the industry press, and I knew how difficult they'd found it to get a publishing deal for Heavenly Sword. So I chatted to him about it, and we sort of slightly bonded over not liking this guy. And then I'd gone to an IGDA lecture that Tam had given in London, where he was doing a talk specifically about trying to get a publishing deal for Heavenly Sword. And I'd sort of I'd had a couple of Jack Daniels and Diet Cokes, and I was feeling a bit bullshit. And so I came up to him and said, have you found a writer yet? And he said, well, we've gone through one test of writers, haven't really found anyone yet, so we're going to be doing a second test of writers. And I said, well, I've got a bit of experience now. Could you put me on the list? And he said, sure. And he took my email, and I thought, I will never hear from him again. And then 3 months later, a producer from Sony got in touch, and I was given an interview, kind of audition piece to do, which I really enjoyed so much. It was in my sample folder for a long time. It was never in the game. It was never really intended to be in the game, but I really enjoyed doing it. And I got an interview. It was about a 4.5 hour interview, and they just sort of shuffled people in and out the interview. Like they got some team members went out, some came in, and then they literally went into the corridor into a huddle, and then came back in and offered me the job.
Oh, nice.
I was like, I didn't think it ever happened like that. And I remember like going to the ladies' Lewis afterwards and going into a stall and just going, yeah. And yeah, so it kind of all went from there. It was tough. I don't think anyone who worked on Heavenly Sword would say otherwise. It was pretty tough, and it was a real learning experience for everyone. But it taught me a lot about cinematic games. Working with people like Tamim and like Andy Serkis taught me a lot, and I could take that forward into kind of other cinematic games like. Well, yes, the Tomb Raider for sure, Mirror's Edge, the Overlord games, Viking, and for a while that's quite a lot of what I did, very sort of linear cinematic style experiences.
It's just so interesting to hear that it got kicked up to that next level, like you're saying, but obviously very difficult. I just wanted to know if, having reviewed so many games over the course of your career, that actually meant that you sort of could make sure that certain things that you'd criticised in the past about games didn't make their way into your specific game. Because if people criticise the way a story's written in a game, and then now you're in charge of kind of writing stuff like that, you want to absolutely make sure that you don't do something that you would criticise of yourself if you're reviewing. Well,
also, I don't think as a reviewer, you really understand how stories are put together and how difficult it is to get even a half decent story into a game. And I've definitely known journalists who were quite like smug and critical when they were journalists, who've now gone into game writing or like, oh, right, this is why it's so hard. It's just like, I remember when you were mean about my game, and now like you're seeing actually how hard it is. And so I was always a fairly gentle reviewer anyway. I was always just very excited about all games that I was given to review. It was. I think it just helped me think about the game as a whole, and I kind of understood a little bit about game design, and that's something that I picked up almost by osmosis over the years, particularly level design and level dressing and environmental narrative and things like that. So I think it helped a bit in thinking about games as a whole and all their different parts, but also for contacts, really. It was great for that. And I came from the gaming press where you got a magazine printed every month, and that's pretty rare these days. And I sort of watched the death of games magazines. We've got a couple around, but there were so many when I started out, and certainly the London-based ones paid a decent wage. Now it's one area that's just gone down and down and down. So I don't envy games journalists coming up trying to get work. There are more outlets, but there are more people competing for these spaces, and it's very badly paid. Yes, certainly is compared to what it was. And when you were reviewing those games, just at this point, I wanted to ask: did you review any of them really badly, or just even a little bit badly? Because it sounds like you were quite generous with your scoring. Were there any that you didn't like at all, like you just hated? No, I don't think there was any I kind of downright hated. Just more like specific elements, I'm guessing. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember like ones that jumped out at me that I really hated. I remember the ones that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed Divine Divinity, which I think is why Sven remembered me, because I'd been the most enthusiastic journalist in the UK about Divine Divinity. And I think I was more in line with the American press, who were also very excited about Divine Divinity, whereas the rest of the UK press were a little cooler about it. And I was just, I had little elements of humour in, which I was kind of excited to see, and I saw something there. And obviously I'm right, because Larry and Adair, look at them now. Yes. And so, I think that kind of definitely helped. And with the SpongeBob game and the Pac-Man game, also linked to a game that I'd really liked that the rest of the UK press hadn't, which is called Ghostmaster. And it was basically you were a otherworldly civil servant sending out ghosts to haunt places and to rescue other ghosts that were trapped. And like I thought it was genius, and it was done by an Oxford-based studio that no longer exists called Sick Puppies. And the guy that had done a lot of design and script work on it, Chris Bateman, who runs a design and writing agency called International Hobo. I think I joined their website because they had a forum for Ghostmaster, and he recognized my name because he'd in fact worked on Discworld Noir. I had no idea about this. I had no dealings with Discworld Noir, or aside from playing some of the Discworld games. I played the first 1 and 2, not so much of the third. And I think he'd recognized my name, and I got a little bit of work through his studio because he would freelance work out to other writers. So it wasn't glamorous stuff, but it taught me the ropes and got me some credits, and that's very important when you're starting out.
I've got to ask you, do you think that the vehicle and the format of video games lends itself quite well to Discworld, because it's kind of, you can almost do anything within it, can't you? So I guess if you do it right, you can do it extremely well.
It does, but Discworld has a very specific tone, and
yes.
It's finding a studio that can get that tone and like the kind of gameplay that suits that tone. I think adventure game gameplay does, and the particularly the first two, and I know the third one is still very highly regarded, and it had its own cool little gameplay techniques, like sort of seeing smells and things as a werewolf. But I have a fondness for the first two games in particular because they were so obscure. Like I wouldn't say Discworld itself is that obscure, but they took some of the small elements and made them massively obscure, like love custard. And I know there was some puzzle which involved you feeding love custard to a sheep, and I can't remember why. And I think with one of them, if you pause the game too long, Rincewind would come and knock on your screen, and that was like a genius. And Eric Idle, voiced him so well. So I think that they were a lot of fun, but we actually don't know who owns the rights anymore. So we're always asked, like, why don't you put them on GOG or Night Dive or something like that? But we don't know who owns the rights. We own the characters, but we can't put a game out because there's code, there's art, there's voice acting, there's things like that. But so many studios were kind of bought and sold over the years. We don't know who owns it anymore, and I'm not even sure whoever owns it knows that they own it.
Yeah. It's I want to come on to Lara Croft and characters in games, because they're obviously hugely important. But before we come on to that, is there a character in particular that you just really love or maybe identify with, or favorite character from a game? Because before, people have just said things like Mario because they find the energy of Mario quite exciting. Is there one character that you love or maybe even would just like to be?
I really loved Alex in the Half-Life games, particularly in the episodes, because she's sort of when I can't remember, I think it's the first episode, or maybe the second. I think she's in both of them, but there's one that I always remember where you're going along with her together, and she makes a noise like a zombie, and then laughs, and it's such a good fake zombie noise, and then laughs, and it threw me, and I thought that is a beautiful little moment. And so I have a lot of love for Alex, and I have a lot of love for Astrid in The Long Dark, which we'll probably come on to because it's a game I play a lot. So I listen to Astrid's voice, who is voiced by Jennifer Hale, a lot, and she talks a lot because to play The Long Dark on interloper mode, which is the hardest mode, successfully, you have to keep your character just from starving. So I hear Jennifer Hale grumbling at me about being hungry and wanting to eat trees, and she could eat a horse, which is saying something because she loves horses, and like constantly over and over again. So I've managed to I really like the story modes on The Long Dark too, and I had a lot of fun with those. But I get sucked into playing the interloper survival mode, and I love survival games. They are the games where I find my dad. Even though we never played survival games together, we lived in rural Somerset. He would take me walking on the woods or the moors and things to show me like the plants and berries and stuff that were edible. And I was sort of fantasized about getting lost in the woods or building a home in the woods and things, because a lot of children's books were about kids just deciding they'd had enough of the world, or adults and just moving to a mountain or the middle of a woods and living life there. And I always thought that was wonderful. And so I always, I sometimes say on Twitter, Ghost Dad in my head is making me play this. And so sometimes there's things like the forest, sometimes it's things like the long dark or among trees. And I hear him as I play. And, it comes down to very small little things, like there's a bird noise in the long dark that reminds me of my dad, because I know he would make fun of it and do a little blah, 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 blah version himself, and I hear it in my head, and every time that bird makes a noise I think of my dad. It's a very weird tenuous connection, but that's sort of where I find him, because I think he would have loved those games as well, and sometimes I feel him nudging me towards a certain game that he would enjoy.
I've got to ask you at this point then, if you have a favourite of all time, or if there's a game that you just, it sounds like you go back to play certain games again and again, particularly survival, but is there one that you would hold up and say, do you know what, it did everything right and it's got replayability and all the rest of it? Does anything stand out to you?
Well, I guess replayability, The Long Dark, is probably the one I played the most. It's still, I find it quite infuriating at times, but it's more me that I find infuriating, like how I die, and I keep trying to get to 500 days in Interloper, which is my sort of personal quest, and it's so hard. I've got to 289.
Awesome.
And like you spend a lot of time being quite bored, and then you kind of do silly things and take risks, and that's where I kind of fall over. And I always get very frustrated, and it's always damn wolves that get me. Like the bears, I've got a system for, but I always try and outrun the wolves sometimes, and I've always just misjudged it. Or I now, like, I have rules for myself. It's like, if a wolf is coming after you and you don't think you can get away, hard quit out, go back to your last save. It's not worth it. It doesn't matter if you're hauling loads of meat, it's not worth it. Like, they're so violent in the game that it just doesn't matter. Or if you've got the bow and arrow, take the shot. Don't try and run. Try and take the shot, because you might just scare it. And I always tend to be a bit conservative with my arrows. So I've got a lot of love for The Long Dark. But yeah, you're right. I have a lot of cozy blanket games. So sometimes I would rather go back and play an older game than try a newer one.
I love it when they remaster. There's a lot of remasters nowadays, and it's a really great way of obviously bringing in people who've never played them. But if you played the original and you love it, and it's your cozy kind of game, when they remake it and it's with modern day graphics and all the rest, it's just so amazing. I love it.
Well, I still actually play Age of Mythology online.
And
I used to play that when it sort of first came out, when it was on disc, and there was for a long time there's only one edition of the discs where the disc worked properly with the multiplayer, and it was like the Titan treasure chest edition, and you got the disc and it would work, and I would play it so much that I would eventually break the disc to free myself from it. But now it's online. Now it's in Steam. I can't do that. So I've just actually had to learn how to regulate myself. And I still do play it, once or twice a day. And I find it a good starter in the mornings, like make a cup of coffee, play a game of Age of Mythology. I am generally not sure I think I'm very slightly better than I used to be, but it's very sporty for me. Like sometimes I'm just utter shit, and other times I am on fire, and it's like I don't understand like the difference, like what is happening in my head that I'm doing it, playing it so well, and what is happening when I'm playing it so badly. But I still play that online. I still love Dungeon Keeper 2.
Oh, amazing.
I love playing the Bioshocks, chaining the Bioshocks.
I'm just doing that now because they've just remastered them again, I think. So
Yeah, 1, 2, Minerva's Den, and Infinite, and the Infinite chapters as well that came afterwards. What else is there? Half-Life 2 and the episodes is always good. I've not played that for a while. I think I might give that a go. But the Thief 1 and 2 is always good. The older games I've still got a lot of love for. So it's new. I find it much, as I say, much easier to go back to them. And I'm always very proud of myself when I find a newish game and I actually download it round about the time it comes out and play it and complete it. Unavowed was one that I played on the day it came out and finished, and I really enjoyed that because it was very old. It's quite old school click and point. It was like a lot of the stuff I grew up with. I think Wadget Eye Games doing some brilliant stuff in the adventure game space. Unpacking was really good for environmental narrative. I think it's a Moss class environmental narrative, and how to communicate character through environment and space and lack of space. And so that was sort of a lovely distraction for a few hours for me.
I want to come on to Lara Croft and Tomb Raider because as games go that are, I just know from personal experience and my wife's experience that got her into a genre of games that she perhaps wouldn't have been interested in otherwise. She's not a huge fan of, story driven, but also having a kind of slightly more open world games than perhaps what she's used to, certainly. But she played Tomb Raider as a kid, and then this new sort of all singing, all dancing cinematic, amazing story came out and drew her in and drew me in. I imagine that being behind the scenes of that was, if Heavenly Sword was hard work, that must have been even more hard work, surely.
Well, I think it was hard work for different reasons. Yeah. I think with Heavenly Sword, we were all quite new to it, so we were all kind of learning together, but we were also using a lot of top acting talent. Andy Serkis as a dramatic director. There were a lot of chefs in the kitchen, creative chefs in the kitchen. And on Tomb Raider, I think we didn't get the weight of expectation with one that we did with Rise. Like Rise in some ways was harder than Tomb Raider. You think it wouldn't be? It's because there was some expectation, but no one quite knew what to expect. There are also obviously a few controversies along the way, which I think we had to deal with. And but basically it was written by myself and John Stafford, so it was a very small team. I was sort of on it for a couple of years. I had a really nice working relationship with Crystal, and I would go over there for a few weeks at a time to work at the studio. And that was great. They gave me my own office. Once they gave me my own office, which was very exciting. So it was tough in different ways. I think Crystal hadn't done such a cinematic game like this before, and so it was a sort of learning experience for them, but probably not as big as the one for Ninja Theory. And there was some expectation. I think it got much more with the second game, because obviously Square Enix had bought Eidos, and they decided to open up the script early on for feedback, because we'd had an issue with the first game script where gameplay kept making me kill characters. So the script had, there was a few drafts in, I think, and they wanted me to kill a character for gameplay reasons, like they wanted Lara to go over here, and maybe it wouldn't work out for some reason. And so I had to do death drafts where I would go in and kill off a character and remove them. And I did this a couple of times. And we sort of realized quite late in the day that tonally this had changed the script. And so we originally had more of a down ending, which didn't feel quite so bad because it hadn't been this relentless cavalcade of death. And then we sort of realized, oh no, players are going to feel absolutely terrible at the end of this. So we actually had to change the ending. So I think we opened up the script early on to try and make sure anything like that was dealt with a little bit earlier on. But that meant it was like a continual headwind of feedback the entire time. So you had feedback from the team, you had external consultants. You had Square Enix, you had Microsoft, you had like 5 or 6 different levels of people giving feedback, most of which don't deal with story a lot, and so there's a lot of feedback that's contradictory and just wasn't useful, and some of it was, and it was like, what it was. So as a writer, it's really brutal, because when you're writing a film script or a TV script, you're usually working with maybe a couple of producers who are very well versed in storytelling. They give very targeted feedback, and it's a sort of gentler process. But this was like, just it felt like sort of opening up your wrists and just like bleeding everywhere. Like it felt so raw. Yeah. Dealing with it all, and I think the first game has a bit more heart, but it's less polished, and I think that the second one is more polished because of that. But I'm not sure if it had the heart, as much of the heart as the first one did. I think the first one will always be very special to me, and I really enjoyed working on Rise as well, because we expanded the team. We had Cameron Sui as another narrative designer, and Philip Collette as another writer. And that was really, really nice to have more of a writer's room kind of a vibe. Like, that's a lot more common these days. It wasn't when I started out. There were games that I worked on where I was the only writer. Like, I wrote all the Overlord games, everything, even down to weapon text and things like that. Generally everything that involved writing. And that's not really the case anymore. Often you'll have writers that one is handling the cinematic story, and maybe one is doing barks, maybe one is doing level dialogue, and things like that. So it's more of a team sport than it used to be, and you get that support from other writers, which didn't really exist growing up in the industry.
Yeah. And just finally, I wanted to ask about some of your more recent projects and what you're looking for next, because I know you did a smaller sort of independent game very recently, which was actually very creative and artistic, and had the words were kind of involved in the actual gameplay and stuff like that, which was really beautiful to watch. I suppose you just do what comes, I guess. How does it work when you're looking for new projects?
Yeah, it's whatever comes along and piques my interest, really. Like, wherever I think there's an interesting angle, the game has something to say for itself. And that's something I'm looking for a lot more. It's like games that have something to say for themselves. I've done a lot of high octane, high adrenaline sort of first person and third person shooters, and now I'm a bit like, I enjoy them as a player, but as a writer, I want to find the path less traveled, and the stories, the stories less told, I guess. And yeah, Lost Words was great, and I was involved in it for many, many years. Actually, from 2014 was when I first met Mark Backler, and because I was early in the team, I got to have quite a say in the narrative of it, and how it was shaped, and how gameplay and narrative intersected. And I think I learned a lot about gameplay and level design during that experience, and that was sort of very rewarding to do. And I've been very lucky that I've been able to work across the spectrum, from like big AAA shiny stuff down to mobile games like Rival Kingdoms, and indie games like Beat Buddy or Lost Words. So I like I just go where the interesting things are, and I work in other mediums as well. So I do a fair bit of film and TV work, or at least I did before the pandemic started, and then exactly. Then it sort of paused that quite a bit. So I ended up doing more game stuff during the pandemic, because it was a little bit more, I think it was more resistant. And, game writers are usually work from home anyway, if they're freelance like me. So I wrote a single player story for Surgeon Simulator 2, which was cool. An unusual project, and not the kind of game you think lends itself to story. So that was kind of a challenge, and it was sort of like very likely Portal-esque type of story, and I wrote a TT RPG called Bard Song. I had a fighting fantasy book out called Crystal of Storms last year, the first woman to write a fighting fantasy book. And another book out in October called Campaigns and Companions, which is it's a kind of jokey art book about pets playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I started that during the pandemic as well. So the pandemic has brought lots of unusual projects across like the creative space my way.
Well, Surgeon Simulator, I was going to say too, having a story in that game must be quite tough because it's more like a sandbox, isn't it?
It is quite tough, and especially as you couldn't actually ever see any characters. Everything was done by voice, so it was quite challenging, and I like finding those challenges and stuff I've not done before. And I've done a lot of stuff, so it becomes harder to find those challenges. But then again, I think developers are also looking for those challenges as well. So we are seeing more original stuff coming out, and we've seen the indie space just really flourish in the last 10 years, and some brilliant stuff coming out from there.
Just final question, are you a PS5, PC, Xbox, Switch, or none of the above gamer? What would you describe yourself as?
I would probably I'd probably call myself a PC gamer. I mean, that's where I come from. It's where I play a lot of my games at the moment, because I was living in a flat for a while, several flats in the sort of between breaking up with my ex-boyfriend and actually moving into my own house. I went into several flats, and then I was much more like PS4 because I didn't have a proper desktop PC. When I got my own home and a desktop PC, I was like back to being a PC gamer. I do have a PS5. I play a little bit on the PS5. I play a little bit on the Switch. It just sort of depends on the game. I played a lot of Left 4 Dead on the Xbox and Far Cry on the Xbox. It sort of depends. It depends a lot on the environment I'm in. But if I've got enough space, then I tend to go for PC gaming, because I work on my PC and I like sort of, okay, now I'm going to do a bit of work. Now I'm going to play some Age of Mythology now I'm going to play a little bit of Long Dark, and I'm just going to try and get a deer down so I know I've got some meat in the bag. And so I'm always juggling different stimuli, and the PC is very good for that.
I guess it works as a creative, doesn't it? Because you can dip in and out when you like.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
I'm very dippy. I am just one of those writers that just, okay, I got like a film going on my iPad, and I'm having a conversation on my phone, and then I've got like a game going in the background, and then I've got various web pages open, and I've got some writing. So there's always a lot of things happening at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us and sharing with us your Monkey Island discs.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Well, that's it. Find us online at Naked Gaming Pod, and we'll return next month.